As of this morning, I have finally read a book by the late science fiction author Barry N. Malzberg. Prior to this, I wasn't that familiar with his work. I had really only heard his name in various vintage SF booktube channels. Usually it's somebody who's got like a bunch of books that they bought and he's just like a part of that pile. Or he's like the kind of name you see when someone brings in a big haul of books to like a used secondhand bookstore, and it's like all the books of their like deceased grandfather or uncle or whoever, and it's like in a pile with like books by Bob Shaw or Keith Laumer or John Sladek or all these other guys that I'm not all that familiar with either. But back in December, I'm sad to say, Malzberg passed away after a very long career and happily a pretty long life. And Matt over at Bookpilled, a terrific booktube channel that you should absolutely subscribe to if you haven't already, he uploaded a video that I thought was a fabulous, I don't even want to call it like a memoriam for Malzberg, but an overview of his career and some recommended places to start. And one of those places that he underlined was the book Beyond Apollo. So I got it from my library, I sat down and I read it, and now I desperately want to talk about it. But first, let's talk a little bit about the plot of Beyond Apollo. Beyond Apollo presents the account of astronaut Harry Evans, sole survivor of the first manned expedition to Venus. Following the mission's catastrophic failure, Evans undergoes psychological evaluation upon his return to Earth. Through his fragmented testimony, the narrative offers contradictory explanations for the mission's collapse and the fate of Evans' captain. Possibilities range from murder to suicide, from alien intervention to governmental conspiracy. The narrative architecture itself replicates Evans' psychological disintegration, offering multiple, incompatible versions of events without privileging any as definitive. This narrative indeterminacy extends to the novel's form itself, with suggestions that the text constitutes Evans' therapy, his testimony, or possibly his delusion. The boundaries between reality and fabrication remain deliberately unresolved throughout the work. If I'm being honest, I really struggled to talk about this book. I turned the camera on, started saying a bunch of stuff about the book and a bunch of stuff about Malzberg and his awards, and then I get to talking about it and suddenly my brain just shuts off. And I'm really struggling to describe like what it is about Beyond Apollo that appealed to me so much in a way that doesn't sound like either gobbledygook or something that would like turn you guys off as readers. So I shut the camera off a bunch of times and almost didn't even film this. I almost didn't even film this video, frankly. But I really want to talk about this book because I really do think it's one of these sort of landmark science fiction reads that you really should check out. I think the first thing that really resonated with me was the accessibility or relative inaccessibility of its structure. At first blush, it's an easy book to read. I mean, it's composed of 67 short chapters, and they bounce around in Harry Evans, the astronaut's experience. So most of the book is centered on either the failed mission where he and his captain are having kind of a meeting of the minds and a little bit of a a little bit of putting their dicks on the table kind of thing. But it's either centered on that or it bounces to later where Evans is in sort of a mental health hospital and he's being questioned about what happened on the mission, what happened to the captain, and Evans in his responses goes back to the story of the failed mission and he'll give different versions of what happened to the captain. The captain killed himself. The captain was murdered by my own hand. Oh, there was an equipment failure. Oh, it was the Venusians over in Venus that caused us to erupt as and potentially kill one another. There's just this aspect of an unreliable narrator that is not so unlike something like Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, but it really kind of goes beyond that because Evans is also extremely mentally unwell. So it's not just that he's unreliable, it's also that he himself does not know what happened necessarily because maybe all of these versions of this story are the real story. Also, the book shares intimate scenes between he and his wife, who have kind of an adversarial relationship. And that is something that I think also plays into the story, because not only is Evans so unwell, he's also potentially a homosexual, and that his failed intimacy with his wife plays deeply into sort of the fantasy scenes that he has when he and the captain are together. He kind of treats the captain as a bit of an object of attraction, and kind of ruminates on the physical aspects of the captain. And that's something that recurs over and over again in the book. One thing I should make clear, though, is that Beyond Apollo is mostly a pretty accessible book. I make it sound like it's this complex, confusing thing, and there is a degree to which the novel begins to break down as Evans himself begins to break down further and further. But this really isn't like a William S. Burroughs thing. Each of these short chapters are so well contained that you can sort of read them as distinct units in one person's experience and find satisfaction in that as a reader. Other things that stuck out to me about Beyond Apollo, well, it's a critique of NASA. So you have to think it came out in 1973, which was only a few years after the moon landing. And what Malzberg kind of posits is a question of, all right, we went to the moon, now what? And the answer that Malzberg presents, rather than some sort of greater adventure out into Ganymede or, whatever, the Googleplex galaxy or something, it's really a question of, was there any point in this at all? His take on NASA is kind of this absurdist bureaucracy that really is using these other missions to cover up failed previous missions, and maybe even theorizing that in his version of NASA, these missions are, at their most insidious, just observational studies of humanity. This idea that these two men are being sent into space and they just want to see what happens, rather than any sort of actual exploratory event. The book also has a lot of explicit sexuality, which is surprising for something that was written in the early 70s, especially within the SF side of things, which I think kind of has a more chaste approach to sexuality, or maybe more functional approach. But here you get warts and all, man. You hear about flaccidity, and you hear about ejaculation and oral sex, and a lot of things that I think could be a turnoff for readers who are not as open-minded necessarily, or comfortable, I think might be the better word, regarding human sexuality. But Malzberg does not shy away. And I think that gets back to sort of his past as an erotica writer. Some of that is sort of imbued into the narrative structure of Beyond Apollo. And what I like, too, is because they're going on a mission to Venus, it kind of brings back that old saw of like, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, particularly as Malzberg gets deeper and deeper into sort of the antagonistic relationship between Evans and his wife, and their failed intimacy, and Evans's attraction to the same sex. I think it's kind of like a cool, smart thematic through line. And then there's just the meta-textuality. It's a writer writing about a guy who's trying to write a book about his experience in outer space, maybe. Or it's a guy writing a book about a guy who thinks he's writing a manuscript about going into space, but it's actually his testimony about what happened when that mission went wrong. Or it's a guy writing about a book about a guy who thinks he's writing a manuscript about his experiences in space, but it's actually all just a big hallucination. This is the sort of stuff that, like, I think Malzberg kind of has a history of writing about in more ways than one. I picked up another one of his books recently, Galaxies, which I think has sort of a similar conceit in terms of like writing about science fictional concepts as a writer. It's just like this really cool, invigorating book. And the way I'm describing it probably doesn't make it sound good at all, but I swear it's one of the best science fiction books I've ever read. And bluntly, I can't think of a single thing I would criticize about it. It is just so thrilling, and I give it 5 stars, which is a rarity for me. I rarely give anything 5 stars, but I am absolutely seeking out more Malzberg as I can get it. I've got that copy of Galaxies that I just mentioned. I've also picked up a few of his short story collections over eBay, and I'm looking forward to cracking those open and getting a sense of like what he can do in the short form, which was kind of apparent in Beyond Apollo itself. If you're interested in reading this book, it is available in paperback form through Anti-Oedipus Press. You can get it, I think, at like Barnes & Noble online. You can also get it directly from Anti-Oedipus Press. There's also a digital version that Rosetta Books has made available that you can get on Kindle and probably Kobo and a couple other things. So definitely check it out. Have you read it? Do you know anything about Malzberg? Do you have any other recommendations for me? I'd love to hear them because the guy has a huge corpus and I don't even know where else to go. So I'd love to get those recommendations. But in the meantime, as always, like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.